This is part 2 of our discussion on the sacrament of holy matrimony, marriage. Last week we took a look at the necessary steps it takes to get married in the Catholic Church, and now we can begin talking about the sacrament itself. Today we're going to be talking about who can receive the sacrament of marriage. And the question of who is particularly important in the sacrament of marriage because this sacrament is unique from all the other 6 sacraments in the fact that the ministers and the recipients of the sacrament are the same people, the couple themselves. By their commitment to each other in the form of their wedding vows, the couple bestows the sacrament of marriage upon each other. The priest is kind of just there for decoration, to receive their vows and to present them to God as a representative of the church. But it is the couple who actually carries out the sacrament. They both minister and receive the sacrament of matrimony, and because of that, there are some requirements in order to be an eligible person to receive this sacrament. The first requirement is age. In the Catholic Church, believe it or not, women have to be at least 14 years of age to get married, and men have to be at least 16 years of age in order to get married, and that seems ridiculous to us now. And indeed, someone that young making those kinds of decisions is a very bad idea. But it wasn't that long ago that this sort of thing was a little bit more common. My grandmother, my dad's mother, was married when she was 16, and that kind of worked out pretty well until death did they part. Regardless, the age of majority in Nebraska legally is 19. So unless they have written consent from their parents, they can't get married any younger than that anyways. There are other requirements to be eligible to receive the sacrament of marriage in the Catholic Church. You cannot be related to the person either by blood, by adoption, or by marriage, like a step sibling or something like that. The closest relation that is allowed to marry in the Catholic Church is basically the equivalent of a second cousin, which I think Nebraska law is the same thing. Also, to be free to marry within the Catholic Church, you cannot have taken permanent religious vows as a sister or brother, or you cannot have been ordained a priest unless a person is dispensed from the vows that they've made by the appropriate church authority, which oftentimes is usually only the Pope himself allows those things to happen. My favorite one, to be married in the Catholic Church, you cannot have killed anyone or hired anybody to kill someone in order to marry that person. So you can't, hire a hitman to knock off somebody's spouse and then marry them. And I laugh, but it wouldn't be a rule if it hadn't been an issue at some point in history. So there's other rarer prohibitions to marriage in the Catholic Church that, are, like I said, rarer. They don't happen very often. But I want to talk about two requirements to get married, to be eligible for the sacrament of marriage, that differentiates the Catholic Church from most other churches and even Christian denominations. To do so, we're going to take a look at how the church defines the sacrament of marriage. And that is, marriage is the matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole life. It is by its nature ordered toward the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring, kind of like what we've talked about in previous weeks, bonding and babies. So first, marriage is a covenant, which differentiates marriage from the contractual idea of what marriage is. Marriage is a covenant, not a contract. It is a sacrament. It is a bond that is formed between two people and God. And this is different than marriage as it's recognized by the law of a nation or a state or a county. Unfortunately, the legal definition of marriage and the sacramental definition of marriage are no longer the same thing because the legal definition of marriage has been separated from the design of marriage that God had built into it from the beginning. So in the church, we call marriage a covenant, not a contract. Legally speaking, though, marriage only is a contract. The difference is that a contract can come to an end and a covenant can't. Which brings us to the next part of the definition of the sacrament of marriage, a covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of their lives. So in other words, marriage is until death, and you cannot be married to more than one person at the same time. And when I say that, I'm not talking about, Mormons, sister wives, things like that. I'm talking about divorce and then remarriage. There is a common misunderstanding among Catholics, for whatever reason, that once a person gets divorced, they can no longer receive communion or be an active member of the church, and that is not and has never been the case. Divorce actually has no effect on the sacrament of marriage, sacramentally speaking. And so we need to separate those two things in our mind. The church is concerned with the sacramental aspect of marriage, not the legal definition of marriage. In the church, when it comes to sacramental marriage, there is no such thing as divorce. The church doesn't recognize divorce because the definition of the sacrament of marriage is until death. And this is clear from scriptures and the direct teaching of Jesus himself. So regardless of whether or not a person is legally divorced, separated or whatever, that really doesn't matter to the church. What does matter to the church is being married to more than one person at the same time. So if you get married and then legally divorced or separated, there is no such thing as a divorce within the church. So you're still technically married at that point. You can't divorce a sacrament. You can't dissolve a sacrament. And so even though a person is legally divorced, in the church's mind, they are still in fact married, whatever the law says. And that lasts until death. And this is where the problem arises, that if a divorced person gets then remarried, Jesus doesn't really leave much room for confusion on this topic. In Matthew's gospel, he says, "I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, unless the marriage is unlawful, and marries another, commits adultery." I'm not sure how you get around that in your mind if you're a Christian. Notice he says, unless the marriage is unlawful. What marriages does the church deem unlawful? Well, that has to do with the topic of annulments, and we'll talk about that at another time. That's a whole other can of worms. But to summarize, you can say that divorcees can receive communion and be active members of the church, but if there's been a remarriage or multiple remarriages, then we have to sort a few things out first. The other part of the Catholic definition of marriage that differentiates us from a lot of other denominations is the one man and one woman part. And this means that you cannot marry someone of the same gender. And so we're going to be spending some time on this. This is a relevant discussion. First of all, when addressing this topic, I tend to phrase things a certain way rather than using words like gay or lesbian or homosexual. I'll say something like people with same-sex attraction, because a person is a person first. A person is created in the image and likeness of God, and sexual attraction was never meant to be the single most important defining characteristic of a person. That is a huge distraction from what really matters, and that is that you are a child of God. So I default to using the term someone with same-sex attraction. And this is a real thing in the lives of a lot of people. It is not something that we can just ignore, like pretend that doesn't happen. So what does the church actually teach when it comes to this topic? And the answer is, it doesn't teach anything other than what it teaches for every other human being. There's actually no difference. I think a lot of times when we talk about these sort of issues, same-sex attraction, gender identity, regardless of where we're coming from, the language that we sometimes use is as if men and women who experience these things are sometimes, out there, that's them, they're outside, the little weird, whatever. They belong in their own little group, that they've somehow separated themselves from the rest of us, and that isn't the case. They are us. We've already established that every single one of us is affected by original sin. Every single one of us has a heart that has been affected and twisted. And one of the results of the fall is that we want stuff that might not be the best for us. And it's never a matter of, well, that's them. They're the sinner. This is us, the good Catholics. It's all of us, every one of us. We just heard that in our gospel today, where Jesus tells the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. The Pharisee is looking at the tax collector as, oh, this poor guy over here, this sinner, he ought to be really sorry. When in fact, we're the tax collectors as well, because we have been sinners too. Every one of us, when it comes to our sexuality, is good intrinsically, but also broken. And so to anybody who experiences same-sex attraction, you are not them, you are one of us. A very close friend of mine isn't heterosexual, and when she told me this, I guess officially for the first time, I was like, well, yeah, obviously. It was pretty obvious to me, at least, because I know her so well. But I wasn't going to treat her any differently, or think of her as less of a person for it. She doesn't consider herself really Catholic anymore, but I still talk to her regularly. I still love her, and that has nothing to do with who she might be attracted to, or who she dates. It has everything to do with the fact that she is a person worth loving, that she was created in the image of God. And it might be same-sex attraction for her, but it's going to be something else for everybody else, whether it's lustful thoughts of other men or women, pornography, objectifying other people, manipulating others, desiring the lifestyle that somebody else has. We're tempted by a twisted heart, by something, right? At first, my friend, she was surprised that I didn't freak out when she told me, but I mean, come on, it's all part of the human condition. We all have crosses and temptations. And what does Jesus tell us to do with those things? He says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. And that includes all of us. So how does the church respond? Well, let's go to the catechism. First, it essentially says, keep in mind this is coming from the catechism, this is official church teaching. It essentially says, yes, people throughout history have been attracted to members of the same sex. That is a thing. If you look at history, it's undeniable. You will find quite easily that this is not a new invention. The catechism continues, its psychological genesis remains largely unexplained. Some people, for whatever reason, they tend to get focused on this aspect of it. Well, is it nature or is it nurture? Is it a choice that somebody makes, or are they born like that? Or is it the environment that they were raised in? The church says it doesn't even matter. Like, that isn't even a question. Family of origin doesn't always have a correlation. The church says that there might be theories and even one day scientific proof of how this all works, but it doesn't really matter what the origin of it is simply the reality. So when people say, I've always felt this way regarding this topic, maybe we should listen to them rather than telling them, well, no, you haven't felt that way your whole life. I mean, when people say, it's not because of X, Y, or Z that I'm gay, my response is, well, I believe you. I'll listen to you. Who am I to question what you're experiencing and how you feel? The genesis, the origin of it remains unexplained. That isn't even the point. To the church, it doesn't matter why. It only matters that it's real. The catechism goes on to say, based on sacred scripture and tradition, homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. And we have to be careful here, because that sounds, the words intrinsically disordered sound like they mean a lot. What does it actually mean? When the church says disordered, it's not making a medical diagnosis, like this person has some kind of disorder, same-sex attraction disorder. We're not saying that, well, this person is crazy. That's not what disordered means theologically. When we're speaking in theology, when something is disordered, it means that it simply doesn't match up with its nature. It goes back to the theology of the body, which is why we started talking about theology of the body first. You can determine how to treat a thing if you know what it's for. And as we've established, the sexual act is for bonding and for babies. And it's for the union of the partners and for procreation. So when the church says it's disordered, it's simply saying that we are using our sexuality apart from its intended function. It's intended for babies and bonding, and we've removed the baby's part from the sexual act, and that is a disordering of the nature of the thing itself. And that goes for all of us. If we use our sexuality outside of its intended purpose, that is intrinsically disordered, theologically speaking. And that includes all kinds of things, from pornography to prostitution to looking at another person lustfully. Sex outside of marriage is intrinsically disordered because it's not for the good of the partners. It puts too much at risk. Sex not open to the possibility of procreation is intrinsically disordered. And so homosexual acts fall into the same kind of category. The Catechism goes on to say, these acts are contrary to the natural law, they close the sexual act to the gift of life, and they don't proceed from a genuine, affective, and sexual complementarity. So what does that mean? We'll actually be talking about this later, but sexual complementarity, if we go back to the beginning, which is why we started with Adam and Eve, Adam's male body does not make physical sense until he sees Eve and her body. And the two of them realize that they're different, that they are not only different, but the ways in which they are different also makes them complementary. And I will struggle to keep this PG, but in same-sex acts, we're now using other parts of the bodies in ways that they were not intended for. It's interesting that a healthy human body is meant to function on its own. We're our own person. Your nervous system works on its own. It doesn't require another person in order for it to work. Your digestive system, your circulatory system, your respiratory system works independently of other people, but there's one function, one system in the body that requires another, and you can't do things on your own, and that is the reproductive system. And it doesn't just need any other random human body or any other random body parts. It requires the opposite sex to make things work. A human body that is different but complementary. Next, the Catechism says, and under no circumstances can they be approved. But neither can under no circumstances can any sexuality outside of marriage be approved. It continues, the number of men and women who have deep-seated homosexual tendencies is not negligible. In other words, they are out there. They are us. Not them, but us. It says, this inclination, which is objectively disordered, constitutes for most of them a trial. And this bears out in my experience. If they could choose, they probably wouldn't have chosen things to go this way. Catechism says, everyone who experiences this must be accepted with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in that regard should be avoided. I'm reading this from the Catechism, folks. This is official church teaching. And so if we think of people with same-sex inclinations, and in our mind, or verbally even, we ridicule them or single them out or think that they should, just go live by themselves somewhere else and not bother us, or that they should be excluded, well, that's not church teaching. Treating people with compassion is not the same as agreeing with them or agreeing with the lifestyle. If that were the case, then nobody would ever go to confession for fear of being, yelled at by the priest. The church prohibits and condemns hatred. And this is an extremely personal issue for people. And so sensitivity is required, and an open ear is required. The Catechism continues, these people are called to fulfill God's will in their lives. And if they are Christians, to unite this to the sacrifice of the Lord's cross. The difficulties they may encounter, despite the difficulties they may encounter, homosexual persons are called to chastity. And in fact, you can take off the word homosexual and you can just say people are called to chastity. And that's what so many forget. All of us, gay, straight, married, single, you're called to speak the truth of the human body according to your state in life. There's the argument, well, you chose the priesthood, you chose celibacy. I didn't choose to be gay. And that's correct, but everybody needs to make the choice to be chaste, to be pure of heart. Those are requirements that Jesus gives us. Blessed are the pure of heart, for they will receive the kingdom of God. That's a choice that we all have to make. And being unchaste outside of marriage is disordered whether you're gay or not. Finally, the Catechism says, by the virtues of self-mastery that teaches them inner freedom, at times by the support of friendship, by prayer and sacramental grace, they can and should gradually and resolutely approach Christian perfection. Basically, what the church is saying here is how some people feel. Sometimes people who experience this can feel like second-class Christians, like they have to hide it. Sometimes people who experience same-sex attraction feel like, well, you say that I belong, but I don't feel like I belong. The greatest honor of any Christian is to become a saint. That's the entire point of the Christian life. This is what the church is saying, is that anyone who experiences same-sex attraction is that they can and they should approach Christian perfection. Just because we struggle with something doesn't disqualify us, not even the slightest. In fact, it can be what gets us to heaven, overcoming the temptation. What we do with our bodies matters, which is what I've said from the very beginning of these talks. No one is exempt from that, regardless of who they're attracted to. Whatever brokenness we have in our hearts, we know that we are called by Jesus to be a saint.